we're diving straight into it. Before we get into that, what did you actually discover about our relationship with birds?
I'm going too far down another alley, and I have other things to say about that topic as well. But so with birds, well, the field of restorative environments in which my PhD was situated expands a lot on the value of particularly natural environments for people's health and well-being, for which there is a large body of evidence. And one of the things I wanted to do was to look more at the nuance of that. So if we're looking particularly at sound and a particular type of sound in nature, do all people respond positively to that? And one of the interesting things I found is that maybe we're casting too broad a brush on, nature is good, we should all spend time in nature. I don't want to sound as though being in nature or spending time outdoors is bad, but I do think we have to think carefully about who we're recommending this to and what kinds of environments. So what I found was that people don't respond positively to all different kinds of bird sounds in nature. Wow. So some they really don't like. So I used a number of different methods. So the first paper from this project that was published in 2013, this was a series of qualitative interviews with members of the public. So I had about 20. And I was asking them broadly, what kind of environments they would go to. If they were stressed and fatigued, would they go to nature? And then narrowing down on the different sensory aspects of that would help them. So was it sound, sight, smell, all these kinds of things. And then, the specific sounds within that. So from that, I got some initial qualitative data about the kinds of birds they liked to hear or didn't like to hear and why that might be. Then in subsequent studies, I actually asked people to listen to sound samples of lots of different birds. And I had objective measures of the acoustic properties of these sounds and also ratings of their aesthetic properties like complexity and pattern, how familiar or how novel they were. And I built a predictive model so I could understand from the acoustic and the aesthetic properties of these sounds how pleasant and how relaxing people found them. So that was exposing people to sounds and building a quantitative model. And then finally, I was looking at links between people's associations of these bird sounds, so memories they might have, perceived meanings, superstitions and stereotypes, and also how that relates to how pleasant and relaxing they found them. So it was a lot of different methods.
So if you were to summarise in a few short sentences what the sort of conclusion was, what would it be?
People find bird sounds pleasant and relaxing, but not all kinds of bird sounds and not all people. So that's a very scientific answer. Some stuff was positive, and but with other caveats to say not all the time.
And you said it related to specific birds?
Yes.
And is that native birds?
That's a very good point. So primarily yes, but in some of the quantitative work I was doing, so building these models of predicting how people feel based on sound properties, for example, I was getting people to listen to sounds from the UK and from Australia. So bird sounds that sound completely different a lot of the time. They're very novel,
They're different birds.
Really different birds. They sound very tropical or, not like English songbirds. And some of them do sound familiar as well. So there was a whole mix. And what I found is that these people were not experts in birds or in nature. They were just, everyday people. If people got confused and thought a bird from a foreign country was a native bird to Britain, they perceived it as being much more relaxing and more pleasant than, some other bird, which might be from around the corner, but they didn't recognise it. So I think there's an important point in there, in that it's often not about the objective properties of the environment. So, extrapolating a bit here from sounds to wider environments. It's more about people's interpretation, or at least I think that's an important contributor. So people can perceive the same sensory stimulus, but based on their interpretations of what that stimulus is, what it means, where it comes from, they can respond in a completely different way.
Wow, and it seems to be that familiarity, a sense of that bird almost belongs to us, played the crucial role, the key role in making them feel like it was healing or restorative or familiar.
It was important. There were a number of different factors. So acoustic properties were also quite important. So I think one of the key things to emphasise here is people were asked to make evaluations about these sounds in the context of being stressed and, not feeling so positive and wanting to recover from those negative states. So if you're stressed, people often want environments or environmental properties that are familiar. They're not going to be, novel and exciting. They're not going to add to people's stress levels. So if you have something that, a sound in nature that is quiet and familiar, is not too emotionally or cognitively taxing, that's probably going to be better for recovery than something that is novel and exciting. However, if you're starting from a baseline of already feeling okay, or maybe like you're bored or understimulated, then maybe something that's novel and wacky and out there might actually be quite interesting and stimulating and regarded more positively. So it's certainly an interaction between the environment and the needs of the person as well.
So it's no doubt, it's actually, it just, in some ways, maybe the biggest aspect of this, it showed the power of sound and the impact of sound and what that can do for your kind of psychological state.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm always cautious because a lot of my PhD and the work I published in this area was about people's self-report about how they feel. So ratings of their mood, when they're answering a questionnaire, for example, an interview, for example. There are other researchers who've taken it further and done laboratory experiments with physiological measures. Further. Yeah, or, we've been doing work at the same time, or, also building on the work that I've done. So I'm always cautious to say that my work is a lot about people's kind of subjective experience. We're experiencing, across psychology as a whole, I would say, but also within environmental psychology, there's now a growing interest in understanding the reproducibility of previous studies, particularly ones that have used physiological measures like to do with stress recovery and heart rate and all these kinds of things. A lot of the assumptions we've made about the value of nature or different environments are based on studies from quite a long time ago. So now we're getting more people trying to reproduce or replicate those results, using more modern methods. And sometimes the results of that are a bit mixed.
I'm very interested in the sort of test conditions when it comes to this field. So what you're doing is you're essentially exploring the effects that the environment can have on us. That's environmental psychology in some ways. And obviously there is criticism of the value of qualitative data and research compared to quantitative. But can you just kind of like run us through sort of what those test conditions were like? Like you did briefly touch on it.
Yeah.
But let's say I'm one of your subjects.
Okay.
I rock up. What do I see? What's going on? What's happening?
Well, I'm going to be annoying here and say it depends on the research question that I'm trying to address. So in that first study I was talking about, it was very, very exploratory because at that point in time, not many people were doing research on nature sounds and well-being. So I started with a qualitative interview approach. So understanding where people would go if they were feeling stressed or fatigued and kind of narrowing down to particular aspects I was interested in through prompts and questions in an interview. And the interviews were very informal. They were something like this. They came to the university and I recorded us having a chat.
Okay.
And then transcribed those interviews and analysed them through various qualitative techniques. I'm a big proponent of mixed methods research, so using both qualitative and quantitative techniques, particularly if a research question or topic is underexplored. I think doing qual work like interviews or maybe mixing it up with observational work as well is very important as a first stage to figure out what are the variables I want to manipulate or explore more quantitatively. Rather than kind of going in blind and then thinking, I missed something important, or maybe there's actually something a little different going on here that actually talking to people would have brought to light. And without wanting to, sound too soapboxy, I do think it's important when we design these kinds of research projects to engage with the end users of the work to understand, what are their lived experiences about environments or whatever else it might be. I think sometimes academics can get a bit too up in their own head about, well, theory says this is important and I think this is important, so I'm going to focus on this, without actually looking first to the phenomena that are going on in the world. So that's my little soapbox piece. But after I did those interviews, then I was interested to narrow down. And a lot of the stuff that came out of the interviews was about these acoustic properties, the aesthetics, how people perceive the structure and the complexity and the pattern of different sounds, but also the meanings and associations. So some of those factors lent themselves very well to quantitative work, like, measuring the sound intensity of different sounds, or the frequency, how high or low pitch that might correspond to. But other things like the meanings that people associate with bird sounds, how can you capture that quantitatively? No, you have to ask people.
And that's one of the things that I wanted to just add as well, is in psychology, how are you not going to delve deep into qualitative research? It's, unless we find a new kind of piece of technology that can go and quantify feelings, which I don't think is that possible without us being the sort of middle person saying, actually, I'm feeling very sad, or I'm feeling extremely happy. There's no other way of kind of measuring that, right?
We have a number of ways. I mean, none of them are perfect, I would say.
How do you measure happiness?
Well, that's a really good question. So you can ask people how happy they feel, and there are a number of published scales where, people respond on what we call a Likert scale. How happy do you feel? How happy versus unhappy, 1 to 5 or 1 to 7. And say you measure that before and after experiencing some aspect of an environment and look for significant differences. Sometimes people try to use physiological measures as a proxy for what's going on with people's stress levels. So if your heart rate goes up, if your skin conductance or how sweaty your fingertips are goes up, that's associated with feeling more stressed, more physiologically aroused. But I don't think any of those things on their own give the whole picture. So what I'm always keen to do is use multiple measures in my work. So the qualitative aspects, asking people how they feel, the more quantitative but still subjective aspects, getting people to use questionnaire responses to, so we have a measure of how they feel. And then if it's appropriate, using physiological measures, although, sometimes I have questions about how interpretable that is, particularly around things like happiness. But it is a big open question, and I do think to myself, what does it really mean to people's experiences in life if you can say, someone's score of happiness went up half a point after they spent time doing X, Y, Z, is half a point increase in happiness meaningful to someone outside of an academic psychology sphere?
Yeah.
So this is why I also enjoy talking to people. And that's one of the reasons I went into psychology in the first place, because I like talking to people. So
great that we got you here then.
Oh, there you go. So I think it's about using a lot of methods in conjunction and making sure they're all tapping different aspects of people's experiences.
That makes sense. I want to talk about the birds quickly again.
Yes.
Because when I was growing up, I saw a lot of magpies. So I grew up in East London. I saw a lot of robins. They're obviously typical all over England, I imagine. Obviously, you go into these towns, you see a lot of pigeons. I don't have many memories of that many pigeons, to be honest, until I moved to Kent.
That's an interesting... I mean, people's associations with birds from childhood I found were very important.
Right.
I don't know if that's associated with the fact that people have generally positive memories of their childhood, or if it's, people are noticing things when they're a child. Everything seems a bit more novel, a bit more impactful somehow.
It's true.
I mean, I think as one grows up, things in the environment become of less import to notice. I think maybe we're all guilty of this idea of not really paying attention to our surroundings, particularly like you've got your phone and then it's, oh my god, I got to get a coffee and I got to get on the train, and the environment sometimes passes people by, whereas we do know from literature that if people slow down and take the time to notice things in their environment, it can impact positively on well-being. But I think this shows the value of people's personal associations with, be it things in nature or other types of environments. People interpret them very differently based on their own experiences.
100%. I think that's what I was kind of hinting at as well, that I think I have a certain connection now to magpies and robins, and if I was to hear a robin sound, I feel like it would have more of an impact on me than, let's say, hearing an exotic Amazonian bird.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, and again it highlights to me the fact that maybe it's not nuanced enough to say, nature is good for well-being and everyone should go out into nature, a couple of hours a week and blah blah blah. You actually have to think a bit more about what are the person's needs and desires, what environments do they connect to, and actually a lot of my work at the moment is about people's bonds with particular places, and then how that can enhance the well-being benefits that they might get from natural environments or elsewhere. So leveraging people's personal connections.
That's amazing. I'm curious actually about the scale you used for measuring how healed people felt in that study, which you call the PRP, right?
Perceived restorative potential.
That's right. So the perceived restorative potential is, in some ways, you use that as a way to kind of quantify how people felt.
Yes. The scale I was using, the measure of perceived restorative potential, I needed a way to quantify how people felt about these different types of bird sounds, because my ultimate aim in that study was to build a model about which bird sounds might be potentially better for people than others if they were feeling stressed, and why. So in order to build that model, you need some way of quantifying, is this a pleasant and relaxing bird sound, and if so, where does it sit in the ranking, and then how does this relate to these predictive factors of acoustic properties and aesthetics. So in that measure, people were asked to imagine a scenario that was fairly relatable to them. So it'd been a long work week and they were feeling tired, and then they'd had an argument, and so they were imagining themselves in this situation of it'd been a crummy week and they were in need of some restoration. So they were asked to imagine themselves in that scenario and then rate how useful or how helpful it would be to listen to these various sounds. There are, of course, some issues with that, in that they're having to occupy a sort of mental model, like, how would I feel in this scenario, which is not a very natural thing for people to do. So it has an advantage in that getting people to think about their experience in that way generates data that makes it possible to model things and predict things, but it's not really representative of people's everyday experience in the same way that just asking them in an interview would be. So it was very useful for the purpose of understanding the relative values of different sounds.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm starting to learn now. It's not a sort of this or that approach with qualitative and quantitative research. You need both. You
do need both, and actually something that I'm also a proponent of is maybe trying to quantify qualitative data. So this is something I've done in a couple of publications as well. So say if you collect qualitative data, interviewing or asking people to provide written text about how they feel about something or associations with something, and then you can do some analysis on that data, work out what themes characterize people's associations, and then try and fit those quantitative aspects into a model as well. So I've done that with some work on place attachment and place memory.
Right. So that's something I really want to get into, actually. The place is a very important topic in architecture. Have you heard of David Cantor?
Yes, he used to work at Surrey.
Really?
Yes.
So I'm reading this. Everything's connected. Oh my god. Okay. So he sort of edited and I think was responsible for the Architecture Psychology Conference in 1971, I want to say, which is the subject of my dissertation.
Oh, well done.
And so he's... so it was basically an architectural psychology conference proceedings paper which he had put together, and I think he had a lot of involvement in there in terms of presenting his own research as well. But I don't know if you're familiar with his work on place as well.
A little bit, yes.
So can you tell me anything more about where the research is with placemaking?
Well, it's a very broad field, first of all. My interest in place kind of comes in this intersection between place attachment and place experience and restorative environments. Because what I realised a couple of years ago is that these two fields have actually proceeded quite separately. So in terms of restorative environments and how different places, and particularly nature, can help people to feel better after stress and fatigue, it's often done in the context of quite generic environments, like just going to nature, or the difference between being in nature and being in built environments, without much regard as to the personal connections that people have with those kinds of environments, whether they have a favourite place, for example. And that's something I did in my first postdoc. I looked at that when I went to live in Finland for a while. I was working with a professor called Kalevi Korpela. So he and I continue to work together on this kind of relationship between favourite places and restoration and self-recovery and regulation. But what I'm interested in is kind of how aspects of place and place making, so place identity and place attachment, how they can feed into the value of restorative environments. So if you have a bond, a sense of attachment with an important place in your life, how that can then impact on your well-being. One of the things I've noticed about kind of place attachment and place studies literature is that there's still a lot of trying to figure out good theoretical models to explain what's going on there. And likewise in restorative environments we have a similar issue about theoretical models. So I think there's a lot that the two disciplines could learn from each other, really.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And you know, one of the things that keep coming to my mind is one of the core reading sort of references we get in architecture school is it's called The Poetics of Space, by Gaston Bachelard. So it's I think it's dates, I don't want to say a date that it's not true. So it's talking about the connections of memory with space, and that's what the whole book was about, The Poetics of Space. And it was essentially touching on the idea that our memories are imprinted into the space, and you can experience what you're actually experiencing is a complete kind of, it's an amalgamation of your memory and your senses meeting, essentially, and that gives you the feeling of what this space is.
That's a very interesting point, and what I'm noticing a lot more of in recent years is again a return towards embodiment and sort of embodied cognition. Some of these terms are also, I think, a little difficult to unpack and maybe mean different things to different practitioners or people from different disciplines, but I think it's along the same lines. So the idea that people's relationships with environments are not just cognitive but also a function of how they experience them physically, like you're saying, with their senses, with their body, and how that physical experience then contributes to place identity, for example. What I do notice is that I think very often these things go in cycles. So we end up every 20 years talking about the same thing. We just package it up as a different term or concept. That can be a bit frustrating, I think, sometimes. Or you realise that you've been, chewing over an idea, only someone else did it 20 years before you. So maybe one of the issues around this is we need a lot more venues like this, where particularly psychologists, human geographers, architects are talking more about the communalities between their research and their practice, rather than beavering away in their own little silos and then thinking, oh, well, how come they never cited my work when I've been doing this for years and years, For example, a couple of months ago, I went to the Royal Geographical Society conference in London, and it was full of a lot of people who were working along similar lines, I noticed, but their research doesn't really reach environmental psychology and vice versa. So I still think there's a little bit of, tribalism, me in my corner and you out there.
Because there's so much crossover, and then it's like there's still an apprehension to kind of make a bit of a leap and say, okay, I'm okay with learning environmental psychology even though I'm an architect.
Yeah.
But like you said, you're probably doing yourself a lot more benefit by really becoming multidisciplinary and embracing, the way they think, because what I found is, coming from an architectural background, you were bringing design into this, but you have to come into this also thinking, try to learn from scientists, psychologists, and think in the way they do as well.
Yeah.
You can't just think like a designer and apply it to every bit of research you have.
No, you can't. I mean, I think it's very important because, psychologists can understand the why and the wherefore and the how people behave in the context of the space. But, most of us don't know the first thing about design. And, particularly if you work in academia, you only have so many hours in the day. As much as one would like to be an expert in multiple areas, it's not realistic. So I think on projects you really have to bring in expertise from different areas. What I am seeing is an increasing interest across the board in well-being, and I don't know if that's just because it's like a hot topic, and everybody's talking about 5 ways to well-being and this kind of thing. But I was part of a really interesting event as part of London Festival of Architecture at Wilkinson Air, where we had a talk on well-being in the context of architectural design. And there was one architect there, Ben Shannon, so he's written a book about links between architecture, design and well-being, applying a lot of principles from environmental psychology.
Wow. So
I do see really good steps towards thinking along a more interdisciplinary kind of line. But it's interesting you bring up kind of this, the history of architectural psychology as well, because this is really one of the foundations of environmental psychology. And as the field has grown, it's, spread out in different areas. A lot of environmental psychology today is about sustainability, pro-environmental behaviour, thoughts about climate change and people's actions around that. But there's still kind of this, old school environmental psychologists dealing with, sensory environments, perceptions of building design. So even within environmental psychology, we're seeing, maybe a form of tribalism, who's old school and who's not.
Right. And then, but those old school techniques or traditions or ideas, they seem to me, from what you're saying, almost as like the bedrock or the foundation of the discipline. And then I guess the more modern ways of thinking of it are like, okay, we need to apply this and maybe change the way we're doing things. So is it, it's not something you exclude yourself from, right? Because those old techniques are really important.
Yeah, I think so. I think, all the principles are really sound. Like, how does a space make people feel? How does it change their thoughts, their behaviour? I think some of the methods, have to be updated, and that's also what we're seeing with this issue around reproducibility. Do some of the old findings from very old experiments back in the day, do they still hold up using more advanced techniques or, trying with different samples, for example. But no, I think we don't want to throw away old research wholesale. We need to still remember where the field came from and, make sure students who are introduced to this discipline are aware of the history of environmental psychology. So this semester at Surrey, when our new master's students start, we're actually going to have a research group session talking about the history of environmental psychology at Surrey. So they get a feel for, people like David Cantor and we have a Professor Emeritus, David Uzzell, who's also done a lot of work on place and heritage. Just a kind of a sense of, what's the history of this field and where is it going?
Wow. So how well is David Cantor regarded in the field?
Certainly very well, I think. I haven't had personal experience of the work he's been doing, but I do know that he has been a very important name in environmental psychology, links between psychology and architecture. One thing that's interesting to me is I think when environmental psychology first developed, it had a lot of influences from sociology as well. And so I think you see that in a lot of the research methods, so particularly qualitative work, thinking about people's life histories. And as environmental psychology, I think, has moved towards other areas of psychology, which are often quite concerned with, more quantitative approaches, being replicable and other kind of factors like that, sort of hard science factors. I think influences from that have also come in. And so environmental psychology has gone through a kind of identity shift, like, who are we and where are we going? But I don't think it's good to forget where we've come from.
I want to talk about those kind of almost sociological, anthropological methods that have been around, and because a lot of them kind of form the, if you like, the earliest examples of psychology in architecture. And things like field observation method, field research, or I don't know what the right terminology is. Field research, field observation?
Yeah, observational research, yeah.
So, there's William White, there's Jane Jacobs, who wrote about it extensively. There's other names I can't remember now, but one of the most sort of well-known contemporary people to do that is Jan Gehl, who's a Danish urban planner, urban designer. And what they would do, and this is actually the subject of my part of my dissertation as well, is, he's so successful right now. He is getting commissions from all the biggest cities in the world, all the decision makers, the people running the government, trying to plan the new cities and towns and improve them. They're all employing him. But he, I imagine, uses quite a traditional old technique of, he goes out and he just watches people and he records what they're doing, why they're standing in the places they're standing.
Yeah.
He just goes out with his students and does this. And then he uses that to sort of form his theory and his philosophy and then his design proposal. And it ends up with things like, okay, the pathways need to be bigger because people are scared to walk on the path.
Yeah.
We need to make them feel more comfortable. I was just wondering what you think about, how do you as an environmental psychologist see that type of research? Is it a bit of a joke to you?
No, I think it's excellent.
Yeah.
I think, what we're talking about here is kind of behavioural outcomes that are measured through observation. And I actually think that's one of the strongest kinds of research.
Wow, okay.
Particularly if you're looking at something where you want to have an applied outcome. I remember back in the early days when I was starting to study environmental psychology, David Uzzell, who's a professor emeritus at Surrey, he showed us, I forget what it was called, but it was an extract from an American film documentary. It was about people's usage of public spaces in urban environments, and it was how where people were sitting in a open plaza changed during the course of the day. So did they sit on this bench or that bench, and it followed where the sun was going, so they were trying to seek shade or sun as they preferred. And the observations from that were plotted on graph paper, and you could see where people were moving. And that's really a profound finding. I don't think we should dismiss this kind of work. I think it's very important.
Great.
Particularly when you're considering, for example, some of the limitations about, self-report measures or asking people how they might feel in a mental model. Well, how do they actually behave in environments? Is some of the questions that, the reviewer asks when you're submitting your manuscript to a journal. How does this actually link to what people do? So certainly, for our students, if we get them to do mini projects or, when they're doing their dissertations, it's, can actually be really enjoyable for them to go out into the field and see how people interact with environments, count what they're doing, count how many paper cups are disposed of. It's important.
So that's actually, you said, looked as a strong piece of evidence.
I think it's really strong. I remember a few years ago I was working with a colleague. We were, co-running an experiment together, and her part of it was looking at how many people press the light switch if they had change in sign in the laboratory about, the light goes on and off automatically or not.
Yeah.
And, she had really robust findings, because it wasn't, how do people feel about the light switch? Or what do they think the light switch will do?
Right.
What do they actually do about the light switch?
So observing behaviour is actually quite a reliable piece of research.
Yeah, it can be. I mean, I think, again, not to sound like I'm sitting on the fence, but it depends on your research question. Is your research question about, what do you want people to do? Yeah. Or is your research question about knowing how people feel?
Of course, and if it's about movement, it's about experience, it's about how environment has an effect, because these are things that operate in a spatio-temporal environment, right? So, of course, then behaviour is very important to observe. It's almost as if, because, by the way, some of these questions I kind of got threw off a little bit, because I came in with the assumption that, which we clarified, that quantitative and qualitative research they're almost separate things.
Well, I think that has historically been the approach, and still many people might say that. I think you can probably tell from talking to me that I don't believe that.
Right.
And I'm, I always try to make it quite clear to students and my colleagues that I don't believe we should, have this kind of division. I think first you set your research question, and then you pick the method that is appropriate to answer that question. I think there's too much of this, I don't do qualitative research.
I think this question definitely applies. So it's actually an example of showing exactly what you're talking about, which I should have clocked actually, and maybe tweaked my previous questions, is actually in a way to show the importance of the subjective and the objective, or the qualitative and the quantitative. You've actually been part of another study where it was actually exploring the connections between subjective and objective data sets, which was done through an app which that the public could use to discover and share tranquil spaces, right?
Yes, so this is a project I'm still involved in at the moment. So working with Tranquil City, which is a startup company, and they're using technology as kind of a medium to help people understand where they can go in cities like London to experience urban tranquility. So getting away from noise pollution, from air pollution, and towards areas like green space that can help them to feel better.
And Sadiq Khan must be on board with that.
Yeah, I think they've had some engagement with the GLA, so getting sort of a letter of support from the Mayor's office. I mean, certainly it's important for inhabitants of places like London to feel like, particularly issues like air pollution are such a big concern at the moment. So Tranquil City recently received some startup investment from Bethnal Green Ventures, and now they're looking at getting integration between their technology and maybe other services or technology. So if people are looking at, where can I go for a run, for example? Can I pick a route that's not only, good for running, but also might be good for my psychological well-being?
Where you take your baby out as well.
Exactly so. So, maybe, just as in, maybe people can be encouraged to get off the tube one stop earlier, or get off the bus one stop earlier and walk.
Get fresh air before you get home.
Exactly. But maybe you can think, okay, if I'm trying to figure out which route I should take, I could take one that is a couple of minutes longer than going direct, but I go through a quieter street that is less polluted, and I can see a tree and there are some birds, so getting people to think about their experience in the city is not just something they have to suffer through, but as something that can be actually enjoyable.
God, I love that. And I'm really going to get into this topic of how data can help us in this kind of movement as well in a second. But in terms of that actual research, the Tranquil Space is one where you had mentioned that it's a way for people to navigate via sort of low pollution pathways. I was talking about how the subjective and objective, or the qualitative and the quantitative, was meeting, and that research you did is quite a perfect example to show the importance of that, because you had these data sets which I believe you could see the track that people were, so essentially they were giving you feedback, right? They were saying, we found this path, or we think this path is best, and that would be kind of recorded by the app.
Well, to clarify, I've been working as a consultant with Tranquil City, so providing academic advice. I'm not part of the development of the app and the integration of the data sets that form it so much. So my involvement is a little more removed than actually working with the data itself. But the idea is that they're integrating a lot of publicly available data sets. So data sets from DEFRA, available in London Data Store. So data.
How do you spell that? D-E-F?
D-E-F-R-A, DEFRA, Department for Food and Rural Affairs. It's probably going to be called something else soon.
It's fine. I'll find it, definitely.
But yeah, so I mean, a lot of these publicly available data sets are about green space, blue space, noise, pollution, those kinds of things. And what Tranquil City have been doing, they've been doing some small scale research on how people feel if they're taking a more tranquil but perhaps longer route, as opposed to a more direct but potentially more polluted or more undesirable route. Sometimes these, the data sets from DEFRA, for example, that are more objective, so they're about, noise levels and pollution, all this kind of thing. They're a lot larger and more comprehensive than some of the data sets we've been working on about people's subjective experience. But a lot of the work I've been doing is about making recommendations based on a lot of the publicly available literature and data that we already know about. So spending time in green space or with blue space links to well-being.
Blue space?
Yes.
What's blue space?
So it could be inland water, like lakes, rivers, or particularly by the coast.
Right, and there is a lot of research to show
this is a growing area.
Right.
So my colleague Kaylee Wiles at Surrey, this is actually a hot topic of hers, so links between spending time by the coast and well-being.
So I think there was a book someone was referencing me as well called the Blue... I don't know, I forgot what it's called, something like the Blue something, the Blue...
Could be. A friend of mine, Debbie Cracknell, she's recently written a book about sort of the therapeutic benefits of being by the sea. Wow. So it might be something along those lines. Yeah. But yes, certainly there's growing interest in that as well.
So it seems we are kind of predisposed to feel at peace with nature. Because we got the birds that you discovered, we got the water that your friends discovered.
Well, this is interesting. I mean, this is, I think, one of the biggest what's the right word to use? Debates in my field about restorative environments. Why do we observe these benefits to well-being about being in nature? Traditionally, a lot of the theories have suggested it's due to some kind of psychoevolutionary action. People might be adapted to spending time in nature. The problem is it's very hard to test those kinds of theories. How do you test an assumption that's based on, humanity's prehistory thousands of years ago? Yeah. From my perspective, I'm interested a bit more at the moment in these cultural and personal explanations. So very often we say, people hear the message, go out into nature, it's good for you. And I do wonder if that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, particularly as, if your day-to-day life is in a busy urban environment. By definition, going to somewhere quieter that is going to be natural is, going to give you a break from those kinds of urban stressors. And also, if you have positive associations with being in nature, we know that if you spend time around nature as a child, you're likely to feel more connected to it as an adult and want to visit more often. So I think there's probably a bit more to it than saying that we might be predisposed, although I'm not saying that might not be a part of it.
But surely then a good bit of research would be to go and investigate people who have solely been raised up in ultra sort of concrete jungles and super urban environments who have no, like you say, cultural kind of, memories or they don't link importance of well-being with nature.
Well, there is some research on this to do with personal identity, and I forget the name of the paper or the authors offhand, unfortunately, but there is recent work showing that if you prime people to think of themselves, more as a kind of a rural person or more as an urban person, that can influence how positively they regard those kinds of environments, and then subsequently the benefits they might get from them. So if you prime people to think, I'm a country girl, me, then they're more likely to feel an affinity for the natural kind of environment. Whereas if you prime them to think of themselves more as, Carrie Bradshaw from the city or whatever, vice versa. So, I mean, that's assuming that kind of one's environmental attitudes can be mutable and can be changed. Maybe there are also aspects about, it being a fixed part of one's personality. I'm not 100% on that. But yeah, I certainly agree that this is an area where there's a lot more research that needs to be done. And again, I think it relates to this idea of nuance, of not saying, this environment is good for everybody, but rather thinking, for whom is it important?
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I keep thinking, like, if you went to China or like Beijing and you got 500 millennials or 50, depending on how ambitious you are, and you took them out into the nature of Sweden, and you're like, how do you guys feel?
Well, ironically, I was actually involved in a teaching project exactly like that.
Really?
So when I was working in Finland, I was part of an international teaching project where we had students from Finland working with students from Hong Kong and mainland China.
Wow, okay.
And
perfect.
Purely coincidentally. And the overall aim of the module was to get them to design a virtual reality game or experience based around nature for the purposes of stress reduction and restoration.
I need references later for this.
It was I don't know what I actually left and moved back to Britain before the end of the project, I'm sorry to say, but I'll certainly put you send you a link to the project webpage. But what I really noticed, and a lot of comments that students, particularly from Hong Kong, were making, is that they were intimidated by the level of wild nature in Finland. So in Finland, it's a very low density population. It's lots of untouched forest. It's a population of the whole country is 5.5 million people. So, even at the bus stop in Finland, people stand a mile away from each other because there's this concept of having a lot of space to yourself. Every man's right to roam in nature, pick berries and mushrooms. It's a nature-oriented society. Whereas in Hong Kong could not be more different. And the nature there, with some exceptions, is quite manicured or safe. And so a lot of the students from Hong Kong, if we took them into the forest in Finland, we're like, oh my God, where's the bear? But and likewise also, it was a bit of a culture shock for some of the Finnish students, and for me also.
To see how they're reacting?
No, but to go to Hong Kong, where it's,
course,
huge urban powerhouse, commercialization, this real opposite kind of world for each experience. But there was a perfect example of people's cultural backgrounds really influencing how they felt.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a city boy inside out, really. I just did that. I just told you who I am. I'm not a country girl, but I'm a city boy. Because I was born and raised in London. I lived in Dubai for 4 or 5 years. Oh, wow. But then I did go to sort of more rural places. But even like some of the studios that we had to choose to be in for this coming year in Masters, I actually got put off by one because they said they're going to China, because I was intimidated by it. And I was like, now you just made me realize that actually, even as a city person, China still intimidates me for like the I don't know why. Maybe it's pictures I've seen, or I don't know where the perception's coming from, that it's just not going to be nice.
It's different. I also had some perceptions myself. I think because of living in Finland, I became a lot more used to kind of a slower pace of life, or less pressurized environments. So being in Hong Kong with this great emphasis on, commercialism and everything, and, don't get me wrong, it was a great place to be, but I noticed the difference in environment, and then ultimately the difference in how they, what these students were bringing to the project, in terms of their backgrounds and experiences. So it's certainly a factor that we should consider a lot more.
Yeah. I want to talk about the data now. So okay. I love that we kind of naturally got onto there, because that was my agenda. But no, you've been part, the work you were doing with the Tranquil Cities, that's directly involving data and data collection, at least from what I was reading about it. So now, data is a tricky subject because some people don't trust it in some ways, especially when it comes to recording our behaviors and emotions and experiences. But I've always had the kind of feeling that if we were able to sort of ramp up the level of quantitative data we collect, So, for example, taking the guy I was telling about who went into public space and looked at people, instead of doing that, if we, for example, we have all of this data that's coming in from Google and even the fitness apps that track where you go, track how much time you spend in places. If we were to use those sort of data sets, wouldn't that take our research and outcomes to a much higher and much more sort of advanced level?
Yes, I agree. I mean, I think one of the issues we're facing today in research is that there are more and more data sets available than anyone can deal with. And sometimes I wonder, simply by collecting more data, is there value in that? I mean, certainly to address specific research questions, but I think I agree we should be making more use of the data that we have. In psychology and social sciences, there are certainly very good initiatives for that. So there's the UK Data Service, which is supported by the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council. So through that portal or archive, researchers from academic or other research organisations can have access to large data sets. Wow. So data that might have been collected through ONS schemes like the Annual Population Survey, the British Household Panel Survey, I don't know if I've got the right name there, these kind of large-scale data collection activities. So very often, as you know, the terms of collecting those data, they're archived and made available to other researchers. There was also one recently, I think in the last year, released called Understanding Society, which has a lot of variables related to environment and community. So how connected people feel to their local community, different properties of the environment.
That's a database as well.
That's a data set, and it's been, I forget when it started, but it runs in waves over multiple years. So I think they've released data over a number of waves now. And so it's, again, very good for, not just improving existing models that people might be looking at, but also generating models over time. So understanding how people's relationship with place or environment might change over time. People at, let me get the right name here, the European Centre for Environment and Human Health in Exeter and Plymouth, they do some really great statistical modelling with these kinds of publicly available data. So looking at changes in well-being after people move to greener areas, for example.
Wow. And that's, the
European Centre for Environment and Human Health, I think. So this is Matt White and colleagues in Plymouth and Exeter. So they have some really good statisticians that they're working with, building these great models using these kind of large data sets. And I think the advantage of this is that it's looking at a national or population level quite a lot of the time, rather than some of these smaller studies that historically you might find in environmental psychology, where you've got 50 undergraduate students in a room, which is probably not that representative and generalizable to the wider population.
100%. I'm glad you said that, because that's the whole premise of my dissertation.
Interesting. So yeah.
So my dissertation is literally saying I'm looking at this guy's work, who I'm not denying them amazing things he's been able to discover. One of them being something called the edge effect, which is he observed that in public spaces people tend to stand at the edges of spaces.
Oh, yes.
They don't like to position themselves in the middle of a square to have a conversation or to stop and look for directions. And in some ways, it might seem obvious, obviously, I wouldn't do that. But for him to go out and actually, quantify and qualify this research, it was breakthrough in architecture. Now it's a principle in urban design. People will always take this into account. But, my contention is it's a very old way of looking at urban design. He's gone and observed, at most couple of hundred people at that one time, but we're dealing with way more people than that in a city.
No, absolutely.
So we need to kind of plug into these data sets, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things about these large data sets is they're very good for giving understanding about, you know, people's attitudes, values, how they feel about broad-based things like their community, maybe how they feel about crime, how they feel about their subjective well-being. For more specific research questions, like, you know, how people behave in a certain type of space, you're probably not going to get those kinds of data very easily from these large data sets. And for resource issues, if you have that kind of specific research question, the most that people can probably manage is, you know, a fairly smallish, relatively speaking, study about one urban square or several squares. So there's a lot of resource trade-off, I think, in here. You can get a really big data set addressing some broad questions, or you can have some specific questions, but your sample may be a lot smaller. You can't have everything.
And we're coming back to, again, you know, the value of having qualitative and quantitative data.
Yeah,
I'm really learning a lot from this. It's good.
I'm glad to hear.
I'm hopefully going to be applying a lot of what I'm learning today in my work. So
excellent.
When we talk about data, however, you know, we've just been talking about all these sort of altruistic motives when it comes to psychology, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of the manipulative things that can come about from this thing. And I've been urged by my tutors to explore that as well, to think about what the damage could be as well from being able to access this type of information. And we've definitely seen that happen with sort of Cambridge Analytica. So I wanted to kind of talk about what your view would be, coming from environmental psychology background, on how you would kind of, how can we keep progressing the field of environmental behavioral and even architectural psychology and continue to innovate and utilize its findings in a way that reconciles the trust that the public has in participating in research? Because I know for a fact that people really don't trust, you know, data and sort of data harvesting mechanisms anymore. The amount of people who don't have Facebook anymore because of Cambridge Analytica is huge. And obviously, you know, you can't really say it's Facebook have always had best practice in the way they've used data. But let's say, you know, fields where they're not as kind of commercially you know, involved, like, you know, academics, and how do we reconcile that trust with the public in a way?
I think that's a really important question. I think ethics are key. So if you're doing research in academia, or really anywhere, you know, you should be considering the ethical implications of the research you're doing. And, you know, at universities we do that by following a set of ethical approval processes. So either, you know, at all stages you prepare the research proposal, you go through a set of processes that will help you understand, you know, is this likely to cause any potential harm to a participant? Are there issues around consent or people understanding what the research involves? And if there are any questions around that, it gets reviewed by an ethical committee at the university, and in some universities that happens across the board regardless of the kind of study. And then, you know, it's reviewed by a number of academics and then either approved, or you're asked to make changes to your research protocol until it can be approved. And depending on who you're working with, you might have to get approval from multiple committees. So if you're doing research in hospitals or with the NHS, it has to go through NHS ethics committee as well. So there are a number of checks in place to ensure that the research methods that are used are appropriate, you know, to the population that's being, you know, utilized in the research. That's not the right terminology, but the participants that are taking part in the research. And, you know, I think that's a really important balance. In terms of sort of justifying research to the public, there is now a huge interest in the research community in open science. So making the hypotheses of research, the methods, the types of analyses that you're doing, and the data sets and results publicly available. So using open science framework, for example, so that people can see the data that have been collected, people can do secondary analyses on them to verify any kind of published findings as well. So I think at various points in the research process, there are a number of mechanisms we can take advantage of. And also, I think it's important that people think about the value, the so what of the research they're doing, not just, oh, it's interesting for academic purposes or to move this theory on, but how can it help people? Why are we doing this? Because, all research takes resources, and we have only a finite amount of resources. So I think we need to be very clear on what the value to the public is of the research that we do.
That's perfectly put, I think. So in summary, it's essentially within, sort of almost before the study, you need to be able to put forward a good criteria for your ethics.
Mm-hmm.
Then you also need to be able to almost be transparent.
Yes.
Because that open science framework is very important, and that's one way of building trust. And then finally, I think that was another great one, is then obviously being able to communicate what the purpose or the outcome is of that research, and that's, I think, where Facebook failed.
That's the thing, but I guess inevitably, because it's a company, a lot of the work they do is to benefit the company.
Sure.
But the issue then, I think, arises when, people feel like they're potentially being manipulated or used in research, perhaps unknowingly. I don't know the specifics and can't recall the specifics offhand of what happened there. But, people need to feel like they're participating in something and understanding what the purpose of that participation is and who's benefiting from it. Is it the company? Is it society? Is it you? Is it me? And I think too often in psychology there's a perception like, oh, I got to get this data, I got to get participants, without actually thinking these are people. They're not just numbers. I am a free man. So, I think we need to be very careful that we don't fall into that trap of thinking, oh my God, I gotta collect this data so I can publish this paper so that I can pass my appraisal next year. It's, what is the bigger importance of all of this?
Right. Definitely. With Facebook probably didn't fail on that front, but they did. I think they did fail on that front in terms of what you just described, like in seeing people as people. I think to them, or to what was going on with Cambridge Analytica was almost dealing with people as just mere statistics or study subjects.
Yeah.
And what they did actually was, I don't know how much but they were able to form these sort of psychological profiles of people. And then that was sold off for data, and so I think I've definitely learned a lot from that. There was one last question, and I've been dying to ask.
Do tell me.
Someone sort of with your background, and I've been looking into sort of sensory design for several years now, in the context of architecture, and I know other people have been looking into it as well. And there's always something that comes up, which is an aspect of our senses which is very difficult to integrate with space, environment, and architecture, and that's taste.
Ooh.
And it's easy to understand how we sort of experience space and object through sight, sound, touch, and even smell. But when it comes to taste, we don't find edible architecture. Oh, not really. And I'm not seeing attempts. I'm not saying attempts haven't been made to reconcile architecture and taste, and the sense of taste, because there's a practice called Bumpus and Parr.
Okay.
They're a sort of architectural background, and they have their way of doing it, but it always kind of ends up being as more of a catering project. But what I'm starting to realize after all these years, not that many years, but after this time, is that the use of taste in architecture is not literal. Because we are dealing with the material, we're dealing with object, and it's not very often or very easy to say that places where you can walk, touch, and grab in public are going to be edible or safe for your taste. So I see it's actually more of a programmatic thing. You can smell the air and touch the materials, but taste operates in a much more sort of different dimension, and that's that might be a specific restaurant, cafe, or bar within the space, and its relationship with the environment. So what I was fascinated by was your research on rituals relating to the consumption of food and drink, and how they result in psychological benefits such as bonding, effective change, and enhanced consumer perceptions. I'd love to know more about this study. We can sort of finish on this, and what you discovered about the importance and effects of specific food and drink rituals.
Okay. Well, yeah, this is a really interesting one because initially I have this other kind of wing of my research, which is consumer psychology. And it's, slightly more corporate in focus, not always. But actually, there's some very interesting overlaps with environmental psychology because of, the kind of environments that people do their consumption in, or buy products or engage with retail services. So this project I was working on at Imperial is about rituals around, it was particularly beverage consumption, so tea and coffee. One really interesting thing I found is that people have, even if they don't identify them explicitly as rituals, they have very particular behaviours around, for example, having a cup of coffee in the morning, what kind of cup they might choose. People were saying, I've got to use my cup that I got from my grandma, or this cup was a wedding present and it's broken but I still use it. So these things had a lot of emotional value to people. And by using them, they were connecting with something a bit more than just consuming a product. It was something a bit bigger and more emotive than themselves. Sometimes the setting was also important as well, so the environment. So people would go to particular places. They had maybe a relationship with an important cafe they would go to, and it could sometimes be a treat if they were feeling tired, or they completed a task, or they wanted to motivate themselves to start a task. Which is interesting to me because if I can't write something, sometimes I'll go to the coffee shop with my laptop. There you go. So it's maybe getting this change of scenery, the feeling like, okay, we're in the space, we've got the coffee, now I've rewarded myself and now I have to do this task.
Wow, that's so true.
So maybe there's something that can be leveraged there, which is, people might do instinctively but don't identify it as a ritual. So, yeah, it was certainly a very interesting project. It actually links with design in that I was working with designers in the School of Design Engineering at Imperial, which is one of Imperial's newest departments. And the field of design of rituals is really new. So there's some people doing work at Stanford in USA, and some people in Norway and other locations, but it's still, I think, a field in its infancy. And a lot of work on ritual has been done from a very, again, sociological and anthropological point of view, mostly to do with religion and culture, but rather less to do with kind of everyday behaviours, consumption, and how we can design in rituals into our life. And also, not much at all on how environment impacts on that. But I think if you spend time interviewing people and talking to people, a lot of my work on that project was qualitative, you find that people do have rituals in their daily life, and it might be things they do at work or things they do at home that really enhance the way they feel. So I think it can be a very important tool.
100%. And in terms of architecture, if somebody wanted to make a purely multimodal space where all the senses are being really not expressed, they're really being, what's the word?
Utilised,
then I forget.
Engaged.
Yeah, where your senses are really firing off in this space, which, arguably is one way of seeing what a successful space would be like. So the taste aspect would be less of a literal thing, but it's more of, what are the restaurants and cafes in that place?
This is maybe what facilitates the experience of, being able to taste food that's good. One psychologist or, group of psychologists that are doing really interesting work in this area is Charles Spence. Gosh, is he at Oxford or Cambridge? I forget. But he's a cognitive psychologist who does a lot of work on sensory experiences and how context can influence that. So, for example, does food taste better if it's served on a square plate versus a round plate? And one of his recent studies he was a co-author on was about how people's perception of the taste of ice cream changes depending on the soundscape of the ice cream parlour in which they bought it.
Whoa.
So, yeah, I know.
Charles who?
Charles Spence. I forget, he wasn't the first author on that paper, but he was one of the co-authors. And they found in this paper that if people heard the sounds of, I think it was birds and the rainforest and that kind of thing, when they were tasting ice cream, they perceived the ice cream to taste creamier, to taste sweeter, as compared to different types of sounds. I can't recall offhand what they were. But so I think taste can be influenced by other aspects of the environment, for sure.
Wow. This is the one. This is it. This is what I've been looking for all these years. Well,
I'll send you the paper.
Please, what effect does, brutal, concrete, what they call brutalistic architecture, does that change the way you taste?
This is very interesting, I think. Yeah, because I think there's still so much to look at in this. And again, a lot of the research I think is quite piecemeal. It's like, stuff on sounds and taste here. No, God. But certainly this work on, I think, taste and how other sensory aspects in the environment might influence that. So there's some interactions, I think, between taste and sound, or maybe taste and vision.
Yeah. I think I've seen actual research on if the colour of the cup was a certain colour, it would change the taste.
And some stuff is intuitively obvious, like you can be served a steak that looks like a steak, and then if you dye it green, it's still the same steak, but people don't want to eat it. It's like, oh my God, what's wrong with the steak?
Yeah, I heard a similar analogy actually of a chocolate. If the chocolate would look like dog poo, you wouldn't eat it, but there's no rational reason to explain why.
It's just chocolate, but
well, we can ask the viewers, do you think you would eat chocolate if it looked like dog poo?
Just shove it in there, hope for the best.
I thought about it. I was like, I'd like to think I would, but
you probably wouldn't.
I really don't think I would.
No.
Especially if it was,
And there are
mushy.
Reasonable evolutionary explanations for this. If there's one thing you don't want to put in your mouth, it's poo.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons.
Yeah. And breath mainly.
I mean, one of many issues. But human instinct is very hard to override in that regard. So it's a fascinating topic. I think there's certainly much to be done linking that kind of work to architectural design.
I love it. Eleanor, Dr.
Yep.
Eleanor Ratcliffe. Thank you. I've learned a lot, and that's
thank
what
you.
I really wanted.
It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Awesome.